in the tradition of our ancestors and in celebration of our history. The First World Alliance invites you to share in our opening ritual. To honor our elders, with those Africans over 60 years of age, please stand. All right. To honor our children, with the youngest African child in the house, please stand or be held up. All right. To honor African life, with those sisters who are carrying a child in their womb, please stand. Oh. Listen, brothers and sisters, let's get the act together, because we are building an African nation. We will honor African life. Brothers and sisters of the First World family, we do thank you. And now, Brother Jones.
Thank you, Sister Kefa. Today's speaker is a relatively young man, even though when you look at him, you can't really say he looks that young. But he is genuinely a young man. In this recent period of time, I sometimes have the feeling that he's aging rapidly. And I think, though, that he has not drawn the correct conclusion from the struggle, because it's supposed to make him younger, not older. The brother may be traveling into the European heartland too often, and that may be aging him rapidly. But now, when he comes home, and he meets all of his youthful comrades here at Mount Zion, there's every reason why he should be rejuvenated. We are assuming and hoping that we are correct in our assumption that what we are doing is sending an African emissary to a European bastion protecting the African interests. Now, this brother left here an African, he has returned an African, and he is going to assure us, based upon his subject matter, that he has taken that little microscopic drop in Switzerland and incorporated it on the outskirts of his African thinking and put it in his proper perspective. The basic thing that this brother has done for us, and we feel we have done for him, is aided each other in developing an African orientation to all of the problems that we face as individuals and that we face collectively. The brother is aware, based upon his whole educational development, of the trends, the currents, and the tendencies in American society, and particularly in the educational institutions that tend to move towards our destruction. The brother has on previous occasions highlighted these tendencies. In the course of highlighting them, though, he has magnified, the positive characteristics of an African understanding and an African philosophy that gives us the kind of microscope and telescope that lets us see what an African future should look like. We expect that today this brother is going to add substantially to our understanding, and we are going to add further to his developing serenity as an African. Brother Jeffries.
Thank you very much, Brother Bill. You you certainly hit the nail on the head in assessing a number of things, including the aging process. Because it is a major factor of being over in the ice in terms of aging. And it is a rejuvenating factor to come back home and be completely immersed in Africanness. And luckily, because of the experiences in the forum, it allows me to insulate that European experience in its real context and not let it overawe the Africanness. One interesting thing, however, is that it seems that I'm always meeting ice folk that affirm the Africanness. And before I get fully into the presentation, I'd like to mention a couple of those instances in Europe. Brother Bill was mentioning that coming back here rejuvenates, and it's got to, because if you understand what I had to do to fly across the ocean, get on a plane at 3:30, arrive in New York at 5:30, come directly to the State Office building at 6:30, and handle a reception presentation, and then move from 6:30 at the State Office building on Thursday to 7:30 at Abyssinia Baptist Church, and be a part of the forum that was there. And then continue on in the morning, yesterday through to 3 o'clock in the morning, and then come in today, and then go to my office after this and prepare a major statement on Namibia for the World Council of Churches at an international conference of solidarity and support for Namibia, sponsored by the United Nations and UNESCO. So I've got to be out of here tomorrow to fly to Paris with this statement, which will be read for the World Council of Churches in terms of their African interest in Southern Africa. So that if you ain't got no strength, and you ain't rejuvenated, and you do not understand your Africanness, you cannot carry that particular burden. But I'm delighted to be able to do it, and the fact that Leonard Jeffries from City College and the First World Alliance has the responsibility of writing a statement for the World Council of Churches in reference to their support of the struggle in Namibia is very significant and important. And I'm glad that I have this opportunity, because it takes me out of the diddly crap that I had to daily deal with up at City College. The diddly crap that the ICE people up there laid for us. And it now allows me to deal with some major considerations of our struggle. The two incidents that I'd like to mention are, one, making a presentation in French last week to the anti-apartheid group of Switzerland. And because my French is pretty good, I was able to clearly express myself, and too clearly. Many of you may not know, je parle très bien le français parce que j'ai passé quelques ans là-bas et j'ai passé beaucoup de temps en Afrique. Et je peux bien parler le français comme les Français, sans accent américain. Oui. Merci. In other words, I can run my little French thing well enough so I don't have that heavy American accent. But once I got to explain, these are liberal white folks now. These are people that are for us, supposedly. But it's quite clear that even these liberals can't deal with us as African people. Even though the anti-apartheid group is set up to deal with African liberation, they can't deal with us as African people. Here I am, the invited guest speaker. And I almost didn't speak because some woman asked me, well, who are you? Where are you from? So I said, I am African. She said, well, what? I said, I am African. And well, I thought that you were from New York. I am from New York, but I am African. And the woman was so negative that I almost didn't do my number for them, because she was saying, look at that. I just came back from Israel, and that's just like those Israelis. They're very racist. They think they're everything, and they got all I said was, I am African. And she extrapolated just on my statement that I think of everything, that I don't think white folks is nothing, that I think that we are this and we are that, and she's right. But once I was able to get past her, and she was a Jew, a Swiss Jew, who couldn't deal with her Israeliness. So she was calling the Israelis racist and equating me with that. She had no idea that there's a whole other thing that we are dealing with. But neither could any of the others deal with the question of my calling myself African. And we've got to begin to understand that that understanding of what we are as African peoples is the key to our survival, growth, development, and liberation. When I was finished speaking, and I had to lay down my thing very clearly to them in an African way, I didn't think I would be invited back. And I had it up and went back to my place, and I did my number. I got a call the other day, we would like you to come back for our General Assembly to take place in May. Whatever I did, they knew there was an element that was important there that they had to hear. Now I'm flying in to be here with you on Thursday. And when you have to fly 8 hours across the sea, you really don't want to be bothered with nothing. Because you've got to sit in this little cubby hole and, and get your frame of reference and you especially don't want to sit between nobody. So you always ask for an aisle seat or window seat. And you definitely don't want to sit between two crackers. 8 hours sitting between two crackers would be a major chore. So I got me my window seat. And lo and behold, there was a middle-aged gentleman sitting next to me. So I thought, sure, that wouldn't be no problem with him egging me and me egging him. And so I slipped into my seat. He sat down. I could smell the garlic on his breath, so I didn't want much conversation nohow. And so I sort of started leaning over to the window and trying to get into my little snooze. And I was off, almost meditating. But you've got to eat on these planes because there's so much time flying. The big thing is the whole eating ritual. So then, after they had served us some drinks, then here comes the meal. And so, of course, I'm woken up. And the woman puts my meal down. Well, I could feel this dude wanting to communicate. But, I was turning away, not wanting no communication. But he saw his opportunity when the meal came. So in French, he rattled off, bon appetit, which means, have a good meal. So, unfortunately, my instinct wasn't quick enough. So when his meal was put down, I said, bon appetit. That was the worst mistake I ever made. And we were engaged in conversation. Now I'm looking at a stone iceman. I've seen many of them in my life. But I could see that this stone iceman wanted to communicate with me. And over the next 6 hours, there was no way that I could sleep. This dude, and I think I have his card in my wallet, confirmed everything that we have said and done in these forums about European people coming out of the materialistic ICE value system and about African Asian peoples being the key to the universe. This is a businessman that's an executive of one of the leading chemical companies. And he was flying from Switzerland, where he has been for 20-something years, to Cleveland, where he will be a vice president. And he completely confirmed that which we have said about our Africanness. He wasn't rejecting my Africanness. He was trying to plug into it and hook into it in any way that he could. This is a very heavy, heavy thing. And he went into a whole thing about do you know Maharishi and meditation? And he has been in the tombs and the temples in Egypt because there's an aluminum factory 700 miles down the Nile near the Nubian border that he spent some time in. So he was talking like Doc Ben about the symbols and talking about, did you see this and that on this temple? And did you notice this and that and this? I could not believe what I was hearing. So it's important for us to understand that when we're talking about our Africanness and us being African people, that is a very key and crucial aspect of our being. And obviously other people think it's important too because they're ready to give up all for that. And so I was very interested in having that experience. But the best experience of all, and I want to lay this one on you, because this follows the pattern of Doc Ben, Doc Clarke, and the rest of us, Sister Kefa and Bill being the symbol of the African family. The World Council of Churches handles a lot of crises. Every day there's crises. I thought it was bad up at City College. But at least these crises are international, major crises. Like the struggle in Zimbabwe now, with the question of Nkomo and Mugabe and the deaths, etc. And the Catholic bishops denouncing the Mugabe government, and then the Lutheran bishops joining them. So then there's pressure on the World Council of Churches to join also. But since the World Council of Churches has supported Mugabe, and the head of the World Council of Churches is an African, they held up on doing anything. So we had a meeting, us Africans, to decide what to do, and I suggested that you should send somebody there to find out firsthand what is happening. And so everybody agreed after some discussion that that's what we should do. So Mr. Sam Kobia from Zimbabwe was selected to go to Zimbabwe to check out the scene. Not to go in to make no reports and to investigate, but to Africanly check out the scene and have palavers with the people. And so Sam was all prepared to go. The next thing I know, Sam is still here. I said, what happened? They said Sam had a baby. Sam had a baby, and it was important for Sam to be with that baby. And Sam took maternity leave to help take care of the other children, and the World Council of Churches stopped because of the birth of an African baby. And that was very heavy. It was no business as usual. The most important thing was Sam Kobia's baby. And everything stopped. And he didn't go. And then after a few more days, we met again, and we selected another African. And he went. So the importance of our Africanness is very, very real. Even in those citadels of white European power, and you can't get no more of a citadel than the World Council of Churches, where people think they are God. But an African baby has the power spiritually to stop the business of the council. And Ambassador Morrow went and came back with our report, and he gave us a larger picture of what is happening there. So it was decided that we would not make a statement, because there are other reasons for why these things are occurring. So at any rate, that little context gives you some idea of what is happening at the World Council of Churches, and I'm responsible for their major development of their Southern Africa positions. And another thing that confirmed the Africanness that's very important is that the program to combat racism that I'm a consultant for used to have a black brother that many of you may know. And he was very active in it and interested in the Southern African struggle. But beside his activities and interests in Southern Africa, he was way on the left, and he was all the way around the back in terms of white women. And in fact, his reputation is international. We still get letters coming through. One came through from a convent. The brother was even doing his number with somebody in a convent. And the people in the program to combat racism were never invited into the African caucus of the World Council of Churches. Somehow or other, because of the way I have handled myself, I'd like to think, and another sister that's there, the Africans last week said, y'all is a part of the African caucus. And I said, well, I'm glad that you all made that decision, because I was going to tell y'all that I'm a part of it, whether you like it or not. And that's where I felt. So that the experience has been a gratifying one, an enlightening one. It will strengthen me in terms of doing the things that need to be done here as I come back on these periodic trips, and when I come back to rebase myself here. And what I hope to do is to be able to tie together some of the things that we focused on in this section of the forum, looking at again our past in terms of our African values, analyzing our present in terms of the crises that we have, and projecting our future. Mrs. Jeffries has just come in, right on time, because she had a chance to come over to Switzerland to give me some support. And so after the Easter, she flew in, and it snowed. It hadn't snowed all the time that I was there, and it snowed. And it rained every day that she was there. But we still had a good time. The thing for me, though, was to make sure that everybody knew that my wife was there. So I went knocking on doors, even doors that are closed. And when a door is closed, that means business is being taken care of. You ain't supposed to interrupt, and I don't want to be interrupted. But that didn't mean nothing for Len Jeffries. He'd go knocking on, bonjour, comment ça va? And many of the Africans appreciated that. Ambassador Noro, when I knocked on his door, he was in a conference with some big wigs. And I said, oh, excuse me, Ambassador Noro, I just wanted to introduce my wife. And he said, jumped up, well, yes. And he came out, said hello to Rosalind. And then I said, go back to the business, and he went on back. And later he said to me, Brother Jeffries, I was glad to meet your wife. But when the sisters come, we've got to treat them right, so I didn't want to meet. I really couldn't do what I was supposed to do in that context. But I think sincerely, that one of the reasons why last week, after Rosalind went back, the Africans at the World Council of Churches decided that we was African was because they saw that partner. And they had respect for the partnership. And it wasn't a European that I was introducing as the partner. And so there was an appreciation of that African family relationship. So that's why I said Rosalind was on time, because it gave me a chance to emphasize that point. So key to us looking at our past, present, and future is understanding the importance of our Africanness through the African family. Doc Ben last week and others have been dealing with several areas of this Africanness in terms of the African philosophy. And I think it's important for us to dwell upon that a little bit. Because in the history books on philosophy, the Africans have no philosophy. Philosophy, the science of knowledge or the study of knowledge, interpreting the human experience and the experience of the world, begins with the Greeks. Plato and Aristotle. And the whole African experience before the Greeks is negated. So it's important when we understand what philosophy is, that when we add that African to philosophy, we are laying the basis for what philosophy really is, and how it came about, and why it is so important for us. When I was in college, and they had a philosophy course, it didn't relate to me. In fact, the philosophy professor almost destroyed me because I went into his class to defend an African and tried to prevent me from graduating. So philosophy didn't have any meaning for me. And that's the tragedy, because philosophy becomes the key to your developing your ideas and your knowledge. And if you turn off from philosophy, then you turn off from a key component of your development. So it's important for us to add African to philosophy and then develop really what that is all about. Now, we can't do that in presentations at the forum. We can only open up your mind to these ideas. We can only lay out concepts and facts that you should be pursuing. But it is in the forum, in the first world classes with Dr. Clarke and Dr. Ben. It's in your private readings of books like The Stolen Legacy, Dr. Ben's work. Check out the Diep's Civilization or Barbarism, or the Cultural Unity of Africa, that we can begin to see, feel, and understand the African philosophy. Because the Africans laid out what we can only call a philosophy of life. The ideas, the values, the knowledge of what life is. And as the European coming out of the ice and in relationship to philosophy, developed and institutionalized by the African, the European not having in his value system that spirituality that we often talk about that comes from the sun and sun people, his philosophy becomes a philosophy of death. And we have to seriously begin to understand that. That when we talk about philosophy, we have to distinguish an African philosophy of life and a Euro-American philosophy of death. And if you miss that distinction, we're in trouble. We're in trouble because many of us, caught up in being educated in the European way, say we have to think in terms of objectivity. And philosophy is philosophy. Sociology is sociology. Political science is political science. Physical science is physical science. And we miss the major point of philosophy being the study of knowledge and an evaluation of it in terms of what it means. So you put an interpretation of values on looking at things philosophically. So the history becomes an evaluative process that when you look and you think in terms of psychology, it becomes not just a science of the mind, but when African psychology is applied, it's an evaluation of the process. When you talk about science, it's not just science for science's sake, but it's an evaluation of what science is and what it's being used for. It's an important distinction I think we need to begin to make in terms of understanding that the interpretation of the African experience and the evaluation of it means a judgment. So objectivity is blurred and subjectivity becomes very important. You can't look at the experience of the Greeks strictly objectively. You've got to look at it subjectively as well and make value judgments. You can't look at the experience of the Africans objectively and assess it. You've got to look at it subjectively and make some value judgments. You can't just see the pyramids as a construction of blocks very scientifically hooked into the movement of the earth and the planets and think of it only in terms of objectivity, scientific objectivity, because subjectively values were put into that building of blocks and the structuring of it around the movements of the celestial bodies. And you have to ask, what are those values? So in us looking at the world, we've got to look at it through a value system and evaluate things. And this is applying philosophy not only to something in the ancient past or something in the present, but also something in the future. So when John Clarke speaks, and Ben speaks, and Ivan Van Sertima speaks, they're not only speaking scientifically and objectively, they are also speaking subjectively because they're making values about that which they are speaking about. I'm not going to look at the experience of slavery of African peoples and use a computer to come up with an argument over whether 4 million were lost in slavery or whether there was 40 million lost in slavery. I'm not going to look scientifically and objectively at those facts. I'm going to know what the science and objectivity is, but I'm going to look subjectively and make a value judgment on why slavery, for who, and what was it all about. So when we're talking about African philosophy, we're talking about value judgments of African peoples on the human experience. And when we do that, we can clearly say that African philosophy deals with life and European philosophy deals with death. And when we make that and when we make those distinctions, we can clearly understand that framework that I have tried to lay out in a couple of lectures. When we talked about, on the one hand, the negative 3 C's, and on the other hand, the positive 3 C's. When we talked about, on one hand, ice people, and on the other hand, sun people. When we talk about, on the one hand, materiality, it's materialism, and on the other hand, spirituality and those things of the spirit. Those negative 3 C's, if you recall, were Christianity from the Euro-American perspective, and that deals with our Judeo-Christian heritage. Number 2, capitalism from the Euro-American experience and the value systems that it represents. Number 3, communism from the Euro-American experience and what it represents. White Christianity, white capitalism, white communism. And when we look at those historical dimensions of the human experience, we cannot just look at them objectively. We have to look at them subjectively in order to make evaluations of what those experiences are. And when we do, we see that negative European ICE value system projecting in everything he does and perverting it. So even though the Judeo-Christian heritage may be part of an African religious experience in terms of life, with the negative value system of the ICE and materialism, that religious experience adopted by the Europeans and transformed becomes a negative one. So religion becomes a perversion with the European value system. It becomes, within the context of the philosophy of death, a death process and not a life process. In the name of religion, European style, more people have died than any other human phenomena. And it is still happening. It happened to us during slavery. Every slave ship was blessed by one aspect of European Christianity. It is happening now in Southern Africa. The people persecuting our people are Christians, Dutch Reformed Christians, who believe in every word of the Bible. whose Bible is the same Bible that's used in this church, who believe that they are a chosen people, elect of God, to do what? Not to deliver love and affection to humanity, but to kill. So you said it correct, sweetheart. You said it correct. And if you don't understand that, then we have not used our African philosophy to see the world experience that which is being set up for our people in Southern Africa is death, genocide, destruction of the worst type that mankind has created, and in the name of the Bible. White Christianity perverting beliefs of spirituality into a destructive force of death. And it is so heavy, it hurts me to see it every day and have the people come in my office and tell me, because a game has been played on us in terms of the reforms and the possibility of improvement in South Africa. And they are instituting the worst type of death process that mankind has seen, using modern techniques that Hitler didn't have. And what he had to do in 4 months in killing 600,000 Hungarian Jews, they now can do in 4 hours. Bantustan's, reservations are concentration camps in which 13 million Africans have been pushed to die, not to live, to die. So we've got to begin to understand that in a cold, calculative, scientific, analytical way, and make some value judgments on that. And so when we look at, again, capitalism, the excuse for death in Southern Africa is that we are protecting and preserving Christianity and capitalism. And capitalism becomes, for the European, a way of death for other people. And they don't care how many of us die. You have an explosion in the mines and 100 people are killed, you flush the bodies out, get the mine going again, and put another 100 in there again. Because the key is the material, mineral wealth, not life. So capitalism, as it has been developed around the European value system, is a perversion of an economic form that objectively would be just an economic form. But when we look at it subjectively in terms of the values that the European manifests there, we see something else. We see death and destruction, not only of his people, but of ours. And if we take the newest manifestation of Europeanness, communism, we've got to begin to understand what that is all about. Mao Zedong understood it. And he put the largest army in the history of the world along what? The Russian border. Not the traditional enemies, the Japanese. Not the Southern Asians in Indochina and others that they've had conflict with, but their communist partners in struggle. And we've got to begin to understand what that means. Because Mao Zedong and the Chinese understood that there was a philosophy of death that had come out of the ice and had manifested itself over the centuries. So these are some of the things that we need to begin to understand fully in terms of our Africanness. And when we look at the 3 C's on the positive side, we've got to begin to understand. And the 3 C's on the positive side relate to communal, collective, and cooperative value systems. And when you take a religious system that Africans have developed, and if you look at Christianity and Islam, you can see its African base, that objectively these are religious systems that are communal, collective, and cooperative. And with the African value systems of life, they become meaningful. But if infected and perverted with the European value system of materialism, they become dead. And so we need to begin to put a framework of understanding together and understand what our African philosophy does for us in making us Africans forever. So the African religious system has to manifest itself with the 3 C's: communal, cooperative, and collective. The African economic system has to manifest itself with the 3 C's: communal, cooperative, and collective. The African educational system, family system. And so that becomes a key, that which the African left us as a legacy. The ancient African was this communal, cooperative, and collective framework and philosophy of life. And it was this framework that allowed the pyramids along the Nile to be built. Iceman can't figure out how they were done. You can't figure it out in a materialistic, objective value system. The only way you can understand it is communal, cooperative, and collective. That the building of these monuments and temples were part of the collective spiritual work of the people. And when you go along the Nile and you see all up and down 1,000 or more miles of the Nile, these temples, you understand that. Twisted history says that these monuments and temples were built by slaves. I was almost beaten up by a white woman up at City College because I had nerve enough to say that in spite of what Menachem Begin said about the pyramids being built by Jews, it wasn't the case. Jews ain't built no pyramids. And if you look at it scientifically and objectively, in spite of what the Bible refers to in terms of some bricks of straw that was pounded together to make some pyramids, they didn't use bricks of straw to build the fence around the horses and the goats. Everything in the sacred building along the Nile is of hewn stone. And this work could only have been done unless it was the work of a collective work of a people, which was involved in their spirituality. And so these are the things that we have to begin to understand. Dr. Ben, Dr. Clarke, Dr. Shekanta, Diop are trying to tell us. Reach back into the past to understand the value system that your people left as a legacy for the world. Then you can deal with your present confusion and controversy, and you can lay the basis for a meaningful future for your people. Christianity in the hands of African people becomes what it should be, a religion of spirituality. Capitalism in the hands of African peoples with an African value system becomes what it should be, a system of efficient productivity. Communism in the hands of African peoples becomes what it should be, a system of equal distribution of wealth. But Christianity, capitalism, and communism in the hands of the wrong value system becomes a perverted system of debt. I'll repeat myself so you can make the point, so that we don't get hung up into the European conflicts of philosophical discussion over Marxism and Leninism and capitalism. So we don't get caught up in the discussions in the wrong way over Islam and Christianity and Judaism. We're trying to provide at the forums another framework for us to look deeper into the human experience and to make it meaningful for ourselves. And one of the key things that we hope that you'll be able to do is to make that trip to the Nile so that you can see what we are talking about. And you can see why it was key and crucial for the European to separate the Nile from us. If I have the fountainhead of your human experience, and I can transform that and hide it from you and graft it onto me, I've completely destroyed your balance and your understanding. And every major European has desired to have the Nile as part of his experience. The first Europeans to rise could not really rise and consider themselves great until they had the Nile. So Alexander didn't consider himself great, I'm sure, until he got to the Nile. And once he was invited in to take it, he tried to graft greatness onto himself instantly for wisdom as to what his future would be. Understanding the strength of the African philosophy and life, because his teacher was Aristotle, who had been taught by the Africans in the African philosophy, which we call the mysteries. When we move to another era of the European, in the Roman times, Caesar and Antony, a good part of their history is around their affairs in the Nile, with one African female ruler, Cleopatra. But it became important for Africa and the Nile to be a part of the Roman Empire, for it to consider itself great. And then we move to another later era, when the French were attempting to establish, in conflict with the English, their greatness. Napoleon, who went into the ice with a magnificent army, and when the ice hit his butt and the butt of the army, they were wiped out. But even if Napoleon had conquered Russia, he would not have felt himself great. His conquest had to be the Nile. And when he took his great war machine to the Nile, he didn't just take an army. He took 150 of the greatest minds of France. 150 of the greatest minds of France were the main component of Napoleon's taking of the Nile. And they were supposed to record and study everything that African peoples had built along the Nile, because that's where the greatness was, in the knowledge of the Nile. And we, unfortunately, because history has been distorted, and as John says, when they colonized our bodies and colonized our lands, they colonized history and knowledge. And with this colonization, we are not able to see clearly unless we can burn through that maze with our African perspective. And that's why we harp and hammer on this point of us being Africans, because it provides another view. You got to work on it. You got to read. You got to study. You got to travel. You have to transform yourself, but it provides another view. And it's the most meaningful view. And what is that view? It's a view of the world in terms of an African philosophy of life, which is an African philosophy of liberation. If we do not, and we're not able to get into our Africanness, we cannot and will not liberate ourselves. You move into your African philosophy of liberation not to wear a robe or a cowrie shell cap or some symbolic jewelry. You move into the Africanness in order to be a part of a process of liberation. And Doc Ben can't liberate you. Doc Clarke can't liberate you. Leonard Jeffries can't liberate you. The liberation process is a process of self-liberation. And one of our greatest minds hammered this home to us, and we wouldn't even know it if it wasn't for programs like Gil Noble, for example, where he could lay on the screen a Frederick Douglass who came out of slavery, liberating himself from that process and continuing to fight so that others could help liberate themselves. Liberation is a process of self-liberation. And ain't nobody can do it for you. Ain't no system of Marxist analysis and dialectic materialism looking at the movement of history gonna liberate you. No system of economic development and prosperity that's going to make you middle class and bourgeois is going to liberate you. No religion which beats you into a certain subjectivity and passivity and lack of understanding of self, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or traditional African religions, is going to liberate you. You've got to liberate yourself. And that economic system that you become involved in has to be a liberating process. The political system that you're involved in has to become a liberating process. And the religious system you're involved in has to become a liberating process. Black capitalism don't mean anything unless it's black liberation capitalism. Black Christianity don't mean anything unless it's black liberation Christianity. And this is the point that we're trying to hammer home. You look at the past in order to understand the present and to project the future. And the concept for that is sankofa. Sankofa is a term and that the Akans use for looking back at your roots and going forward. And when the king, Nana Sapan, the representative of the Santahini, the king of kings, was here, we became very cognizant of that because he was trying to deliver a message to us that look back at your roots and understand them in order to go forward. And this becomes key. You don't become Africans of the past or understand your experience of the past in order to keep you in the past. You need that understanding in order to deal with your present circumstances in order to project a meaningful future around your liberation. And so as we look at the history and we can see the various phases of history, we can see several key important phases, which again I'd like to lay out. One is that phase, that ancient phase, that original phase is very important because around the Nile Valley, as our great scholars have said, is the origin of humankind. Now we can harp on that statement a long time. And Doc Ben and others can talk about the early finds of fossil man and humankind in the Nile and the Rift Valley of East Africa. But we have to go beyond the finds. What becomes important is the value system that these early people developed and what it led to. And what early mankind in Africa, humankind in Africa led to was a development of humankind in relationship to each other as families and the beginnings of the rudiments of society. So Africa is not only the origin of humankind, it is also the origin of society. And most of this has been kept from us because of this objectivity in terms of the finds. You have found fossil remains in Africa, but objectively, you can't make any judgment as to who and what these are. It's the earliest find several millions of years ago is Lucy, and another find is Gindathopus, but you can't make any judgment as to who these are. However, if you start applying your African frame of reference, and you know, for example, as Diop outlines in his book, Civilization or Barbarism, that there is a law called Gobler's Law, that mammals in the sun develop pigment. And whether we like it or not, we as mammals. And if the early finds are in Africa where there is the sun, those people were African people. Now the fossil remains may not say that they're African, but the context at which those fossil remains developed quite clearly says that. So we've got to apply this whole knowledge system so we can begin to understand this whole range of history that has been kept from us. And as African men and women develop their philosophical concepts of life in the Nile and society, then because of the peculiar circumstances, geological circumstances and ecological circumstances of the Nile Valley, they were able to move into high culture along the Nile. High culture along the Nile, which we refer to as civilization. And not high culture for a few years, for a few hundred years, but for thousands of years. When you talk about a golden age of Greece, you're talking about 200 years, from 500 BC to 300 BC. When you're talking about a golden age of the Africans of the Nile, You're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 years of sustained development at a peak no other people have maintained. So it's important for us to look at the history because it has to be our present situation, our future development has to be based upon an understanding of it. So when we look at the Africans of the Nile and we look at the African philosophy of history, one of the key things that comes out of it is a concept of cycles. History moves in cycles. Humankind relates to cycles, a cycle of birth, cycle of death, a cycle of rebirth. So this concept of cycles becomes important for us because if we don't have it and we look at our present situation and then we look at it over the past few years, it becomes very pessimistic. And if you can't look at history in the long view in terms of the cycles of development and understand the concept of death, rebirth, resurrection, then we won't be able to fully have the power to do what we need to do in terms of our liberation. So that African concept of cycles becomes important, and it comes out of looking at the history. Again, the African philosophical systems develop, and looking at the human experience, an understanding of the laws of nature. And in an understanding of those laws of nature, the movement of the celestial bodies, the relationship of various manifestations of humankind on the planet, relate to a concept of harmony. Human life relating to harmony. Blending with the circumstances. These are laws of nature that science discovers and claims. But Africans had discovered these many, many centuries before. And that's why when you see along the Nile, you see a harmonious development, even when the temples were built. For example, Queen Hatshepsut built her temple along the cliffs of the valleys of the king to harmonize with the setting of the rocks. And it's an enormous architectural achievement. The design of it almost looks like something modern. But for us, it's not even important, the design. It's the value system that went into the temple building and what that means in terms of the cycle of life, death, and resurrection and rebirth. And so we've got to begin to look at these concepts, the concept of cycles of history, the concept of harmony with the laws of nature. And another important African concept relating to life is the concept of complementarity. Complementarity, again, in terms of the male and the female. Complementarity, again, in terms of the human and the animal. Complementarity in terms of the earth and the sky. This becomes very important because out of the ice comes a concept of dislocation and alienation. And instead of the male and the female being complementary, what do we have? A male-dominated society in the most vicious way. Instead of there being harmony between the laws of nature and the laws of humankind, you have the transformation of nature and the destruction of it. So that now we're leading to the point where there is a chaotic situation in the world where the Iceman of the North American continent, the Americans, and the Iceman in Moscow have arrayed against each other 50,000 megaton atomic bombs over here and 50,000 megaton atomic bombs over there, and they're ready to what? Really put nature's laws to a test. Insanity, perversion of understanding of what life is, death value system. So that these, again, become part of that African philosophical concept, which is us developing us as Africans together. The concept of cooperation, which the Africans were able to sustain to build Nile Valley civilization, becomes a key to understand. Because certainly those great monuments, as I mentioned before, could not have been built unless there was an enormous system of cooperation. The Nile floods for 3 or 4 months. And so if the people haven't cooperated in raising the crops and in storing the crops and in distributing the crops so that everybody can be fed, there would be death along the Nile, not life and development. So the concept of cooperation is one of those keys that we have in our culture. So what we are saying is that these concepts build Nile Valley civilization. They help sustain other African civilizations that developed, for example, in the Middle Age period, the medieval period. They help sustain manifestations of African systems that developed in later periods among the Yoruba, the Manding, the Dogon, the Akan. But these systems were shaken to their roots by the rise of the European. The first rise of the European, as John Clarke says, was the Greco-Roman period. And that permanently put into stagnation Nile Valley civilization. But in spite of that, the cycle of African rebirth and redevelopment continues, and Africa rose during the medieval period when there was a movement across the globe in terms of Arab Islamic civilization, and there was a rise in African civilization, which we refer to as the Sudanic empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and the kingdoms and empires along the coast that became Ife, Oyo, and Benin. Africa was to take the imported philosophies of other people, Arab philosophies, and transform them into another level of African civilization. So Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were Islamic, but African Islamic cultures and civilizations. Along the east coast of Africa, Islam met Africa, and they developed Swahili culture, and they were African Swahili cultures. The African value system again rising to the top and being a source of sustaining life. When this cycle reached its end and Islamic civilization went into stagnation and retreat, there was another rise of Europe. And as I have mentioned before, that rise took place in the period which we call the 50-year turning point of history, 1482 to 1534. And I get a big pleasure out of this 50-year turning point of history in which the African was moved off the center stage of the world, and the Asian was moved off the center stage, and the native indigenous peoples of America would move off the center stage, and the European, coming out of a continent that had for 1,000 years been in disarray and was land poor, resource poor, and people poor, the European coming out of feudalism and chaos, the bubonic plague, was able to put together a system of exploitation in that 50-year turning point. And I'm laughing now because I'm over in Geneva, where the city of Calvin was, and the Protestant Reformation, and that becomes an important part of that 50-year turning point. It's not funny for us because that became the beginning of the major process of our exploitation into the modern era. Because from that 50-year turning point of history, the basic foundations of the European materialistic value system of exploitation were laid. And Europe, which was land poor, resource poor, and people poor, at that historical period of time, within 50 years becomes what? Land rich, resource rich, and people rich in unbelievable dimensions. Nations in Africa with gold that the Europeans had never conceived of. Nations in the Americas, the Aztecs and the Incas with gold and silver that the European had never conceived of. And he was able to put together this new resource into a system capability of exploitation because of the value system of debt that he operates on. And then he was able to increase the cycle of death by a perpetual period of wars and conflicts over materialistic pursuit of greed. And out of that 50-year turning point comes our slavery and genocide, and the genocide and slavery of Indian peoples, and on our backs and out of our blood comes the second rise of Europe. And in the second rise of Europe, the gold and the strength of Africans and Indian peoples was used to build what? Capitalism out of the slave system was developed in this period of time. And that capitalism eventually develops through cycles that it becomes what? Communism. Capitalism being an extension of the conflict class dialectic struggle and becoming communism. So I see the materialistic European coin having two sides. One side capitalist and one side communist. We make distinctions of what that is all about, but it's part of the same historical process. And for us, that historical process becomes death. And we need to understand that. So out of this 50-year turning point comes the European system of capabilities for exploitation, colonialism, imperialism, slavery, capitalism come out of this. The nation state of Europe comes out of this period. The nation state which has caused the conflicts of war after war as each European nation tried to control the slave system. This international slave system that hooked up Europe with Africa with the New World. And if you don't believe that we are still going through that conflict today, then you have a misunderstanding of history. That the initial people who struggled for control over that slave system that was developed in the early 1500s were the Catholic nations of Portugal and Spain. And for 100 years, they roamed the world and prospered off the blood of others in that triangular slave system. They had their wars with each other. And out of this period emerges the Protestant Reformation. First with Luther in 1517, then with Calvin in 1532. And what comes out of that is another rationale for exploitation. A rationale which says that certain people are the elect of God, predestined to rule over others. And when you put that concept of exploitation and the elect of God with the new emerging nationalist concept, then you have a very powerful dimension of exploitation. And the Protestant nations, with this new rationale for exploitation, were able to conflict and beat the Catholic nations and take over the slave system in the 1600s. So the 1500s was the era of Spain and Portugal. But by the 1600s, the Protestant nations of England and Holland had dominated the slave system. The Spanish Armada, which was defeated in 1588, is the turning point of when the Catholic nations lost control over the exploitive system and the Protestant nations dominated. And as I mentioned here before, it's important for us to understand that connection between Protestantism and nationalism. Henry VIII introduced Protestantism into England. And it wasn't a religious concept for Henry. As I have said before, it was a penis concept for Henry. Henry VIII's Protestantism doesn't come out of a religious conviction. It came out of the desire to mate with a woman and get rid of his wife, and the Catholic Church said, you can't do it. So Mary was gotten rid of, and Anne Boleyn was taken on, and then he took on another religion. And this new religion of Reformation was hooked up with the nation state of England, and the new exploiter rises to the top. And England becomes a dominant factor for a couple hundred years in control of the slave system. But because of historical circumstance, England and its materialism and its efficiency with this new capitalist system realizes that exploitation of chattel slavery is not as efficient as exploitation of wage slavery. So a new exploitive capitalism is developed, led by the English, which says it is better to exploit my own for cheap or no wages, virtually no wages, than to worry about a slave system which has all these trappings that you have to take care of and that are economically insufficient. So you get a conflict between the old slave system and the new slave system led by the English, and people don't understand that historically, and many of us are still saying, as John Clarke and I would attest, because we had to learn all of this, that the English had an abolition movement, and they abolished slavery, and they went around the world restricting the slave trade. We have to understand why. We have to make some value judgments as to why the English wanted to abolish slavery? Why did they stop the slave trade? Because they were moving into a more efficient exploitation of wage slavery. Not because of any sentimental reasons of helping black people, but because of some cold-blooded interests that they had. So we have to understand this in terms of looking at things from our African perspective, and this gives us a whole nother view of life. And as we see this system of exploitation that the European developed, and what I'm trying to lay out is this 500-year exploitative system from 1482 to what are we now? 1982. So that's 500 years of exploitation. And each European nation that rises to power rises with control over this system or rises as it conflicts with others over control over the system. And then we have to understand that we can't get involved in that process because it's a continuation of the destruction. Somehow or other, another process has to emerge out of the African experience. What I'm trying to lay out now is that we looked at our ancient past and we saw the values that our people developed in terms of the concept of cycles, the concept of harmony, the concept of complementarity, the concept of cooperation, the concept of religion and philosophy, the concept of spirituality and creativity were those attributes and systems that our people left for us. And as we moved into this medieval period where the European rises to a world position, we began to get another value system dominating the stage, a value system of greed and exploitation, institutionalized around systems of exploitation that have as a cover and a camouflage Christianity, capitalism of a free economic system, democracy of a free society of voters, and this Christianity of the whites, this capitalism of the whites, this democracy of the whites is disguising an insidious exploitive system in which millions, tens of millions of people have died. War after war. War after war has been the result of this system. As the European moved to perfect the system and new nations got into the struggle for control of it, the American nation emerges. In the 1700s and in the 1800s, it begins to dominate the scene. And in the 1900s, this contemporary century, it does dominate the scene. But what emerges out of that conflict is the Russian state to compete worldwide with America for dominance. So the process that began with the slave trade in the early 1500s and continued with transportation of billions of our people across the oceans, and later, when slavery was destroyed by our liberating process, a new and more efficient form of slavery became institutionalized. From 1860 to 1900, the system of European exploitation becomes dominant in the world, and by 1900 I consider it the period of the triumph of European imperialism. From 1860 to 1900, only a period of 40 years, the European was able to dominate the world. Irony is that out of our need emerges his greed. When we destroyed the slave system, it allowed the capitalist corporate system to emerge. And the capitalist corporate system becomes the new instrument of exploitation. And it's hard for us to see the parallels that I'm trying to make, but the connections that I'm trying to make, but it needs to be understood that the 14th Amendment, which was designed to give the Africans of America their freedom as citizens of America, became the instrument for the development of a corporate capitalist body, and that corporate person got the rights that we were supposed to get under the 14th Amendment, and that allowed the corporation to run free around the world and dominate it. This is a point that ain't in the history books. It's a point that you would get in lectures that John and others would give. That out of our struggle for liberation emerged a new form of exploitation by the Iceman under corporate capitalism. Corporate capitalism takes on the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to give us our citizenship. And in that citizenship were the three main ingredients of American constitutional development: due process of the law, privilege and immunities of the law, equal protection of the law. And that was supposed to allow this African, now free, to function in American society. Instead, it led to his re-enslavement because the capitalist system was able to get the benefits of interpretation of the law and create a corporate monster which has dominated governments and controlled the land and wealth of the world, and now dominates in such a way that we can't even use national interest as the key factor in the power, development, and exploitation of the world. It's corporate interest. We call it multinationals. These corporate giants, now, they don't look at the state interests of the nations, that they have international interests. They have wrecked the American economy because there's greater exploitation to be made in Taiwan and Korea and other parts of the world. So they have taken out. So it's important for us to understand these historical dimensions and looking at this framework that I laid out of the African philosophy of life and the European philosophy of death. Over the last 500 years, the European has instituted step by step, progression by progression, into greater development of death, to the point now where he has poised against each other 100,000 megaton nuclear warheads ready to have the ultimate act take place. And if you don't believe that what I'm saying is correct, that the European system, philosophy, and core is a core of death, just think on that for a few moments, what all of that means. And why are these systems poised at each other with this destructive process? For control over land, labor, and resources. Russia is a monster. It has no need for any more land. It is the largest landmass on the earth. But still the Chinese have to keep an army up against the Russian border to prevent Russia from seeking more land. And Russia is not giving back to China or to Japan or anybody else the land that they got during World War II. Whether they are communist brothers in struggle or not, you still ain't getting back the land that I got, and I got more land than anybody else on the planet. Where is that value system of unity that's supposed to be coming out of the communist system to destroy the capitalist system? Contradictions which we need to begin to understand. And America doesn't need any land. But we have poised against the Russians these weapons of destruction. And this is the insanity of the Iceman that we have to extricate ourselves from. Our task is difficult because over the 500 years while the European was getting control of the land, labor, and the resources, he also was getting control over our mind. And the African that went into the slave system was transformed, unfortunately, to a certain extent, into a Negro. There were no Negroes before the slave system. Negroes sprung up whole hog out of the slave system. You cut the African from his roots and you manufacture a Negro. Diop has a chapter on the myth of the Negro. And we need to understand that the Negro was a manufactured item to be better exploited in America. If you control a person's history and you take his roots away, then you can control him. Slavery would be gone in 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, if the millions of us, our ancestors in slavery, said, we are African, free, and liberating. That's the end of slavery. That's the end of it. Your liberation is tied into your will, and you can will your liberation. That's the key to our having these forums. But do you understand that you are the key factor? You will what happens to you. Other people may enslave you, but the extent of your slavery depends upon yourself. You have options. It wasn't just Patrick Henry that said, give me liberty and give me death. There were plenty of Africans that said that. And they shook that slave system. So it had to be structured in such a way that there were massive fortifications and massive police measures to keep Africans in slavery, because there are many Africans that say, give me liberty or give me death. No people can be enslaved if they will their freedom. If we are in a trick now, it is because we have not willed ourselves out of the trick. If we are having problems in New York City, it's because we haven't willed it. Just to use an example, which is not a good one, but it shows what the will can do, was Chicago. Black folks wasn't supposed to even win no electoral victory. It may not mean nothing to them because you got to control the system that's there. But somehow or other, black folks in Chicago had been tricked too much. They was tricked with Daley, and then this woman came in and she ran a game on them. She was going to identify, so she moved into one of the worst housing projects in the history of the world. They got a 5-mile housing project in Chicago running along the railroad tracks. 5 miles long, and it ain't even safe there for the muggers in this housing project. But Jane Byrne decided that she was going to identify with black people, and she was going to move in and take an apartment. And she did move in, so they say. But I'm sure that she had enough police that the muggers was taking a holiday. But the trick was that Jane ran a game, a public relations game on black people. And at the same time, they was losing jobs. The school system was falling apart. The police was still kicking them in their butts. And so black people willed that there's going to be a change. They willed a change. And even if they didn't win, they shook up the whole system by saying that we as a body are going to go in one direction. And we don't even care if this Negro is a grinning Tom. He's been arrested. He done done it. It don't make no difference. He will what we want. And this is what we need to understand. Our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and in Africa are wanting of one thing: the will to liberation. It is there. A number of vanguard people and institutions have it. But the collective will to liberation has to be implanted and sustained. And once that takes place, the whole thing will change. The will to liberation is what our Africanness is all about. How did we survive the slave system? It was a will to Africanization. The Indians were destroyed. Tens of millions of Indians were destroyed in the slave system. That the Indian is a remnant now. Africans thrived under the most oppressive system that has been structured in the world and the most dehumanizing. Because the African philosophy of life allowed us to survive the slave system. It wasn't any paternalistic white masters. Why have we have a debate on a good master and a bad? But there was no such thing. Any fool that's a master is a bastard. That's all. Good masters and bad masters. One only gives 50 lashes, another gives 100 lashes. We have to understand that. We survived the slave system intact as African peoples because we maintained that African philosophy of life. You all don't understand that historical period from 1865 to 1875. That's a period you ain't even supposed to deal with. You're talking about your civil rights, and John has said many times, he said many things, But he said, if you looked at that the 19th century, that's the century of your liberators. That's the century when they were arrayed up against a system that had completely dominated the world. A system that had complete and utter control over when you went to the bathroom. That's the period and when our greatest people rose individually and collectively. But you ain't supposed to know that. When we moved against the slave system and said it's over, it was over. When we were armed to add that military might to our will, it was over. The slave system was gone in a year once we got fully into the battle with almost 500,000 of us. But the trick was that emerging out of our freedom was this corporate monster. 1867, the 14th Amendment. 1867, J.D. Rockefeller put together Standard Oil. And this corporate monster took our rights and began to exploit the world in another way, another trick. So that when we moved into our liberating process in 1865, 1875, we had achieved something that no people on the history of the earth had achieved, coming out of slavery, supposedly crippled. That part of the history is not in no history book. You have to go down to the South to see that. You have to go down to the South to see what had happened in the southern part of the United States. Black folks weren't given nothing. They took it. They asked for land. We had this 40 acres and a mule. Part of our history. Never got it. But they got land. How did they get land? They took the land. You go down the South and you see some buildings, some churches and whatnot. I saw a brick church in South Carolina. I said, well, how do black folks get this beautiful brick church and whatnot? They built it for the white boy. And when they won their Civil War and the Liberation War, they took that church. And it's still there. And by taking the land right after the Civil War, black folks in the early part of this century had 29 million acres of land. It wasn't given to them. They took it. And then they said they're going to get their own institutions together. And so the basis for 100 black educational institutions was laid by people just recently out of slavery. We can't put together one decent black educational institution today in America with 30 million of us earning $175 billion and all these PhDs and BBDs and DVDs. And even those institutions that come out of that historical period from 1865 to 1875, we are losing them. Some of those institutions like Howard and others come out of a railroad car, come out of a shack, come out of a barn that started these institutions and were built by black people. Fisk University was saved by black people going around the world singing the Fisk Jubilee singers, singing gospels around the world, helped put together money to sustain Fisk. And it developed black lawyers and doctors for 100 years. And now the $175 billion Negro cannot sustain a Fisk University today. Fisk is dying. Howard is lost. There are more Jews in power in Howard in key positions than black people. So we've got to begin to understand the history. And then when you have institutions, the 5 schools that developed in Atlanta, that really come out of the black folks' desire for some liberating educational process. But as we became integrated into American society and assimilated in the value system in terms of integration, we lost a will to our Africanness. And so even Atlanta, which is not Jewish controlled, and still has some beautiful institutions, but they're Negro controlled. They're not African institutions. They're Negro institutions. And unless and until the Atlanta University complex is transformed into a liberating educational process around Africanness, it will stagnate as Negro institution building. Negroes build institutions to attach themselves to the system of white oppression, to attach themselves to the big house. You build your little cottage in the back. Africans have to build an independent system of development, even if it starts with nothing. It's a matter of the will. We can't even get an independent black school together, an independent African school. I mean, it's a tragedy. Because we get caught up into how much money am I going to get? Or how much money are you going to have to pay a week? And we don't understand that our people did not make it that way. They work communally, cooperatively, and collectively to sustain institutions, to sustain communities, to support each other. And that's what it's all about. The will to liberation comes out of our Africanness. But if we get caught up in this trick of assimilation, we're in trouble. Because assimilating into what? Assimilating into the system of death. But you'd be surprised how many of us are still into that assimilation. And if we want to look at some of our real problems as a people and our leadership as a people, look at the problems of their assimilating white values. If you want to see a conflict between a Garvey and a Du Bois, look at what it meant for Du Bois to be in Europe studying and to come out of the mixed parentage that he had. So he himself understood that, and he talked about a two-ness, two souls in one dark body, a double consciousness, two souls in conflict with one another. And as we have said here many times in this forum, that unless and until that African soul wins that struggle within, we won't have a major victory without. So in order to keep control of African peoples in the period of 500 years of our dominance, control over our land, control over our resources, control over our people, control over our minds, a Negro had to be created. And he is everywhere around us. He's in us. And unless we have a heavy dose of Africanism to neutralize the Negro, it will always manifest itself. It's that ingrained. African states on the continent, the richest continent in the world, are stagnating or going backwards. And Africa has become a continent of death when it has always been a continent of life. We have to seriously ask ourselves what is happening, why it's happening, and what can we do to change it? On the TV, night after night, is white folks' call for relief to help the people in Ethiopia. As we have said many times, Ethiopia is one of the richest lands on the globe. It could feed all of Africa and most of Europe if properly developed. Ethiopia. But there are millions of people dying in Ethiopia. And we have to say why. The African system would not allow that to happen. But when the game has been played between the competing systems of European greed, on one side capitalism, on one side communism, then you see what the result is all about. Uganda is a paradise. It is the Garden of Eden. Yes, sir. Rich lakes, rolling hills, and forests. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying in Uganda. Why? And unless you look at that European system of death and see that African system of life and how it has been neutralized, you won't understand what is happening in paradise. Anything can grow in Uganda. Anything can grow in Uganda. Ghana. Ghana is dear to every one of us. John is a Ghanaian. I like to consider myself a Ghanaian. When we went to Africa over the last 20 years, the place that was the most dynamic for us was Ghana. You could feel something special in Ghana. Nigeria might have been the biggest. Ivory Coast might have been the cleanest. Liberia might have been the most interesting, but the most real was Ghana. Ghana is dying. Ghana is dying. Ghana is dying. Ghana is rich. Ghana has gold. Ghana has diamonds. They can grow cattle in the north. They can grow tubular inyam plants in the center. The Accra Plains, if properly agriculturally sustained, could grow vegetables and other crops. But Ghana is dying. And Nkrumah came in independence with almost $1 billion. And now Ghana doesn't have anything to sustain itself. We have to ask ourselves why. And the process of that destruction took place as the European began to see he had to destroy this African movement for liberation which Nkrumah symbolized, which Sekou Touré symbolized. If you understand what has happened to Fidel Castro, where he has been neutralized and stagnation has taken place in Cuba, which is a very rich island, you can understand what has happened on the African continent, because Nkrumah and these others went through that same process, and when they couldn't be bought or they couldn't be killed off, then coup d'etats took place in country after country to transform Africa from a movement of liberation to a movement of stagnation. Coups in Ghana and Nigeria, 66. Coups in Uganda, coups in the Central African Empire. And when I went to the Central African Empire a couple years ago, I saw what all of that modern African state system meant. Unless and until the African developing the modern state develops an African state, he's lost. And nobody else is going to develop it for us, because everybody else is interested in our exploitation. As I mentioned here before, in the Central African Republic now, but a couple years ago it was the empire. One of these coups that took place when a progressive African leader was running the Central African Empire, it was decided in Paris to overthrow him, and they were deciding who to pick, and they picked some little general or some little army officer from the French colonial army, and they put him in power in the Central African Empire. Bukasa. And Bukasa, in power as a military dictatorship, caught up not in his Africanness, but into a European insanity, decided that he was going to become an emperor. And as poor as his state was, he was going to have an emperor's coronation, assimilation, integration, identifying with the oppressor. He was going to have a coronation like Napoleon. And he modeled his coronation on Napoleon's coronation. He had a coach built in France, a gold coach to transport him and his empress. And then he had a special little thing built for the Dauphin, the prince. That wasn't enough. He had a throne of gold built, a peacock throne. And in order to make the empire real, he had to buy a diamond, a $5 million diamond. This is the insanity. But when I went there and I saw what was happening, I was shook, because in the Central African Empire was every European nation and America. The Americans were there, the Swiss, the Germans, the French, the English, and across from the Americans were the Russians, the Libyans were there, the Chinese were there. All of the competing ideologies of the world and all of the different spectrums that we fight over were there, and they were all in on the exploitation. Russia didn't pull out its embassy to say that emperorship is gone these days because we're into the Communist International. China didn't pull out its embassy. Libya, the leader of the Arab world, didn't pull out its embassy. All of them were there, sustaining an empire. And it wasn't until some high school kids deciding that they were going to will a change, and they began a boycott and a strike, and a couple of hundred of them were killed, that there was a change in that nation. So unless we can move away from the philosophy of integration and assimilation and move into fully a philosophy of Africanization, the transformation of the Negro, which is what we are about now, won't take place. And so we have to move into our Africanness. If we do, we will transform the world. If we do, we will transform the world. And the key to that I can see as I travel. In Southern Africa is an important understanding of world history and the power of African people. Once the Southern African wills the destruction of his system of destruction, it is gone. And the consciousness of the need for that will is taking place daily. It's taking place with the women. It's taking place with the students. It's taking place with the union leaders. It's taking place with people who are not even active and conscious, but they're being forced into taking us. It's taking place with the church, the Christian church. Doc Ben said yesterday that if a religion does not serve your liberation, it's not a religion for you. There are people in Southern Africa, black Christians, that are saying if the religion is not a religion of liberation, and if the God of the Christians is not a liberator, then I am not a Christian, and that God is not for me. Now, that statement wasn't done by some youngster off the street. That's a statement in an article called The Divine Intention by Bishop Desmond Tutu, who told the South African state that I am not afraid of you. The only phenomena that I'm afraid of, and the only phenomena that I am beholden to, and the only authority that's meaningful for me is the Almighty. And He's a liberating Almighty. Now, if you don't know what this means and how powerful that is, Bishop Tutu ain't got no armies. Bishop Tutu is this high. Bishop Tutu could be whisked away. But the fact that he could even say that if his Christianity is not a Christianity of liberation, and what the whites have structured, apartheid, is not a heresy and an evil and a devilishness, if he can't say that, then he doesn't want to have anything to do with the Christian faith. Now, once this is infected into the people, things have to change. So because of this, Bishop Tutu may be dead. If not dead, isolated and banned. Because you cannot have the leader of 15 million Christians of all stripes saying the things that he is saying. I wish some of our ministers here could hear it. But circumstances produces character. And in South Africa, you have a circumstance which is producing not a Christianity of submission, a Christianity of slavery, but a Christianity of liberation. Now, this is hard for us to deal with, but we have to begin to understand it as things develop. But even that Christianity of liberation, which has Bishop Desmond Tutu declaring that apartheid is evil and the South African state is a heresy, even that concept of liberation has to be within an African context in order to sustain the people. Because the basis for the Christianity of Southern Africa is European mind control. The Christian church was brought in as missionaries not to liberate, but to control so the land could be taken from the Africans. And what African philosophy of life has done, and this is a point that I have to develop at a later point, is that those Africans that were sucked into the Christian system to be controlled have used the African philosophy of life to turn Christianity around on the very Christians that brought it in to control them. This is a very heavy thing that's happening. That the blacks that are in the Dutch Reformed Church, now can you imagine a black person in the Dutch Reformed Church where they developed a philosophy that we are subhuman? Blacks sucked into the Dutch Reformed Church have now turned on the Dutch Reformed Church, declaring it a heresy. willing to die for the principle of liberation. So this becomes a key thing for us to understand, willing your liberation through your Africanness. And although many of us are not serious about it, we will be faced with the reality of becoming serious. Because what I want to wind up with is that the system of exploitation that brought us here as slaves, African captives and enslaved us, the system of exploitation that exploited our liberation and turned it into a new form of wage slavery, has reached its peak and its pinnacle of perfection in Southern Africa. And all of the high technology of this system, the monstrosity of Nazi Germany, is being perfected for our people in Southern Africa. And if we are not aware of the need for solidarity and African brotherhood with our brothers and sisters in Southern Africa, we will be faced with the situation of Jews today who were making money while their brothers and sisters were going into the oven. And they don't want to have an inquiry or a commission studying what was American Jewry doing while the others were going into the oven, because it will reveal what actually happened. We cannot be in a position of having our brothers and sisters put into a genocidal process, and we are making money here in America. We have to understand that the liberation process of an African on the continent is part of the liberation process of an African in America, is part of the liberation process of an Africa in the Caribbean, and our liberation is tied up together, and it has to be willed together. I want 2 seconds to show what willing will do. In South Africa, the game is played that there are reforms. But this article came out in Newsweek, and Brother Bill, I have a copy for you. This is the International Newsweek article that tells that the reforms ain't reforms, it's just a more efficient cover for genocide that's moving apace to be unbelievable. 13 million Africans in Southern Africa have been put in concentration camps for death. But this white boy who wrote this article wasn't supposed to write it. And so his wife is now under trial in South Africa because she hid the documents when the South African police came the day that this was published. The South African government protested the United States and said that this is not correct. What they mean is that you're blowing the cover. And they're probably talking to Reagan, you've got to control your people. They're going to blow the whole thing. The deal we got hooked up to wipe out these African people. And the interesting thing in terms of mind control, your Newsweek does not have this article. Your Newsweek does not deal with this. And what you got was a rewritten version of this. So if you want to understand mind control, news control, and knowledge is power, we are in the midst of that now. But fortunately, with the African system, knowledge does get to where it's supposed to get, and information does, through the African grapevine, get to where it should be. And so when I was told by Africans that they would not get this in South Africa because it was banned, they said, we'll get it there. We may not even be able to send the whole magazine, but what we'll do is we'll send page by page. When they say there's a book that will be banned, they say, we'll get it there. We'll send it page by page and re-put it together in South Africa and get it out. This is the extent to which some of our people are dealing correctly. But we have a role, and I want to end with this, Brother Bill. We have a major role because the inspiration that our liberation and our situation gives to others is a major factor in willing their liberation. The little things that we do here, which we think are insignificant, are major things with people struggling for their liberation. And we have to begin to seriously think of those things that we need to do in the future. One fellow was just killed in South Africa, a Mr. Nkisi. He wouldn't have been significant to me except that in this article they talk about a black spot. Now, many of us have been called black spots in our life. Because, you know, we like to play with each other. You just ain't nothing but a black spot. But in this article, when the South Africans are talking about black spot, they're talking about black genocide. They have in here, talking about apartheid's new grip, a picture of the different concentration camps. All of those pink areas that you see are the areas that black folks have been set aside to die in. And they are no longer citizens of South Africa, so the South Africans don't have to do nothing with them. Don't have to feed them, don't have to take care of them, don't have to do nothing. They can just sit there and die like rats in a barrel. Black spot means that land that black people own for 100 years, some of it signed by treaties before the South African Republic was a republic. Black spot means that any cracker seeing black folks on land can say, I want this black spot removed, and they have to remove it. In this instance, here's a man sitting on his land with his community saying they're not going to go. And this is just a story, so it doesn't mean as much. Except the story came alive. It came alive last week when another quiet, timid black man was saying to the South African government that our people are not going to go, Mr. Nkisi. And he was organizing his people to protest their being removed to a dead-end death situation, and the South African police in cold blood killed the brother. But then his death becomes part of the life force of African peoples, because immediately the South African rallied to him. Now, the game that was played and the trick that was played was that America, your government, Ronald Reagan, in the Rand Daily Mail, is outraged over the Saul and Kesey shooting. And a protest was sent to the South African government. I'm going to send a personal protest to Ronald Reagan, and you're going to get a copy of the letter coming from the World Council of Churches and Leonard Jeffries, that you've got some nerve to be worried about the death of one individual in South Africa who exposes the system when actually millions of people are dying and other millions are slated for death. And it's a system of destruction that is in place that has to be destroyed, and not individuals that are taking outrageous acts. But this is what is happening. But look on the page also in terms of the game that's being played. Black and white together. Doesn't that remind you of something in our country? Black and white together. Athletes playing rugby, cricket, and soccer. Game that's being played. Some of our people going to South Africa playing cricket for $100,000 when other Africans are dying. But the African struggle for life is such that we're going to win. And I'm sure we're going to win in America, in the Caribbean, and changing things in Africa, and particularly in Southern Africa. And this is why. When they had the funeral for Mr. Nkisi, normally there would have been a couple hundred people there of his followers to mourn the death of this man. But the African philosophy of life means that you celebrate death because it's part of the cycle of rebirth. And so when Mr. Nkisi was buried, there were thousands of people who came to the funeral. Thousands of people that came to the funeral. Even his local people didn't understand where these thousands had come from. But they soon learned why they had come and what they were doing. And as you see, as they take his coffin to be buried, all of them have their fists raised in the black power symbol that we institutionalized in the United States. It is unlawful in South Africa for black folks to assemble, but thousands of people assembled at this funeral. There were thousands of police, and they could have, and they should have, because there was a violation of South African law, blocked this funeral from taking place. It did not happen. It did not happen. The South African government said, don't bother those Africans. Don't touch a hair or hide on them. Everybody was there. Bishop Tutu was there. The ANC was there. The people had the ANC flag, which is illegal and banned in South Africa. The government of South Africa, with all of its military might, with all of its nuclear might, with all of its secret police, was not going to touch these Africans because they knew that these Africans had willed their liberation and were ready to die if any South African had touched these black folks. And that is our key. Willing our liberation. An understanding that is built around our Africanness. And if we grasp that, we can transform our life. We can transform this maze that we're in. We can transform the religion that we have. We can transform our family situations. And we can rise like a phoenix, like Garvey says, up, you mighty people, do what you will as Africans. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Jeffries. We'll give the speaker a moment to relax himself before we have a few questions and a bit of a discussion period. I want to remind you, first of all, of next Saturday's dance. You can purchase your tickets today. They are only $10, and it is taking place at the Finley Student Center, 133rd Street at Conference Avenue. And that's next Saturday. I have a modification and a correction to make about tomorrow's presentation at Robeson House. The major presenter tomorrow at 4 p.m. will be Professor Jerry Price. Professor Price, would you please stand? She will be the major presenter. So she will be there tomorrow at 4 p.m. There is a special class with Brother Baba Ishangi on Wednesday, May the 4th at Uhuru Sasa Center, 357. All right, yes, brother?
Understand the question correctly, it is that what can we do to deal with this dilemma that finds us in the system and not being able, and having to function and survive in it, and not being able to, right. Well, we've been in the forum over the years, and in the Africana school, and in the trips to the Nile Valley, trying to hammer home to our people that the key is the change that you produce in yourself in terms of understanding your Africanness and moving into an African value system so that as you survive in the system, you survive as an African. As you relate to your family, you relate in a different way. You relate to your family along those African values. You relate to your wife in a different way, your children in a different way. So survival in the system is not to survive and act like the people of the system. But survival in the system is to get over so you can begin to put in place those African institutions, those African values, those African processes that can sustain you. And then as you hook up with other people, you can pull together something more than just survival. You can pull together some development. So it's not, for us, it can't be a pessimistic thing. If you understand that Africans in these Americas, from the Caribbean, from Brazil, from Central America, from North America, come out of hundreds of years of abject slavery. We survived that. Because of our African value system, we were able to develop under that and come out of that with our psyches intact, even though there was a massive Negroization process that had taken place. So if we could survive that, we can certainly find the means to pull together survival and development today. So that means your children have to be, they can't go into the school system without some defensive measures. You've got to start to deal with your child as an African in the womb. it starts. Because it's got to be in your head and the head of your partner. And as that child goes into the school system, he can begin to deal with that. Looking at TV. You don't let an African child watch the TV. You don't let an African child watch the TV. Why should an African child watch the TV? Do you have a reason? We survived thousands of years without a TV. Why do we need a TV? And not only do you feel that your children need the TV, you got to have one in the living room. You got to have one in the bedroom. You got to have one in the closet. Some people have them in the bathroom. When that which is coming across the TV is mind control, separating you from yourself. And so this is what I'm trying to say. In terms of educating, in terms of living together, there's another way of operating. In terms of worshiping, if you have the Islamic faith, it's got to be an African Islam. If you got the Christian faith, it's got to be an African Christianity. If you ain't got no faith, you still got to be African. And that becomes the key.
Yes, my brother.
I'm a bit concerned about the fact that we are the foremost in terms of class and so on to the struggle in South Africa. But oftentimes when there is a demonstration, I see one set of people, the same faces all the time. Everywhere there's a struggle, there is the same faces. And I see a lot more faces here. I want to know why it is that people, I'm sure that some of us can't make it in certain situations. But I think to a large extent, a lot of us just don't try hard enough to come out of these struggles. And it is important. Because if every one of us says that the next guy to come, I ain't going to go. And the next guy says that, we ain't going to have anybody else. And I think we ought to really put our bodies where our mouth is. Okay? That's very important. The other thing I want to say is there was a Tony Brown journal a couple of weeks ago featuring some Africans called the Bushmen or Suriname Maroons. Now they escaped when they were brought out of Africa from the slave ships, and they set up this community in the jungles of South America. Now in that jungle, they, without anything, they would accept the skills that they brought with them. They were able to maintain a civilization untouched. Today, we have the building of the Trans-American Highway down to Brazil, through Central America. Part of the struggle that's happening in Central America is about that highway that's massacring a lot of Indians. Okay? Now, that highway is going to pass straight through where that community of Africans live. And it is going to disrupt them. And I think we need to rally behind that. Because in that is the essence of the African experience before it was contaminated by the European civilization. Now there's also another problem coming up about technology.
My brother.
That the Africans did.
My brother. No. Don't
So I just want Dr. Jeffries to comment on these things. Okay?
My brother, we appreciate your comments on those things. Thank you. Yes, sir.
The question is the greenback dollar. And Adam Powell said that all America.
My brother.
The greenback
No, just a minute. Do you have a question?
Yes, the question is.
No, I thought you wanted to ask a question of somebody in the back.
Now, on this greenback dollar, you will see a picture of the pyramid, and you will not see Jesus Christ, and it says, "In God we trust." The question to the world, to the day, and to the black people, the God of the pyramid is the God that has always been, and the God that shall always be, the Son
Whether it is a question or a statement, we will use it to have our speaker sum up what additional thoughts he may have had. We thank you.
You have a question, Brother Sam?
No question. He wants to know when you're going. You want to go off the wall too, right?
We'll try to end with that and try to tie in some of the other questions or statements, because the question about the Syrian Africans relates to genocide. We use the term genocide, which means the death of a people, in order to explain the whole system that the European has developed. And his genocidal process has affected his relationship with his own people. So if his relationship with his own people can be clarified and precisely pointed to as genocidal, then we have to understand what his relationship to us has been. If, however, your mind is controlled, your flow of information is manipulated, and you don't have a sense of self and a sense of your past, then you not only become a victim of the genocidal process, you become one of the perpetuators of it. The worst exploitation of black people today is by other black people. Everywhere. Whether we're talking about the Caribbean, whether we're talking about America, whether we're talking about Harlem, whether we're talking about Africa. Because the genocidal process involves also mind control, cultural genocide, besides physical genocide. And that allows black people who don't understand self to act in a worse way than some whites. We need to understand what that means, and that means that the European system has been successful in putting a buffer for itself in its system. The African, and we can't make the mistakes that a lot of our people make when they say, well, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. That's true. Africans sold other Africans into slavery. Africans is selling other Africans dope right down the street, right outside the door, as part of a system of genocide and destruction. But if you understand it in terms of systems analysis, you understand that it is a system which has infected even the victims, and the victims become victimizers of other victims, even their own families. But it has to be understood in systems terms. If you look at the world in terms of systems, you can see that the system of slavery was hooked up into all the European systems: his religion, his politics, his economics, his education. The system of dope is hooked up into all his systems. It's an international system that imposes dope on our community. The junkie is a person we have to deal with, but if you do not deal with the system, you're not dealing with your reality. So this is why we use the term genocide, because it explains clearly what is happening. Genocide physically, genocide culturally, genocide socially. We here are a small group compared to what we have out in our community. There's more dope fiends out in our community than we want to count. And the dope fiendness has passed from people in their 20s down through people in their teens, down to youngsters. What is happening to black youth is a genocidal process. Drugs, no jobs, no hope, no education. And the only people who can give them that are us. And so we have to understand genocide. And if we don't, we won't be able to do what we have to do in terms of our liberation. That's why I use these heavy terms, because that is the reality. And you do not travel around the world the way I do and not see that. People in Europe, and there were no black people in Europe. The black people in Europe were there by mistake. When 50 million Europeans were killed, that was Europeans killing each other in genocide. You don't take a whole fortress of bombers, 50 or 100 bombers, and fly them over a city and drop millions of tons of bombs. Now, that's not war games, that's genocide. And the European is involved in that process all the time. We're in a break now, just getting a little rest before he goes into it again. World War I, World War II, World War III, Korean War, the British this and that war. Britain and France fight each other in terms of 100 years wars. The first 100 years war, then the second 100 years war. That's the history. And we have to begin to understand it. So when we talk about liberation, that's what we're talking about. And when we talk about genocide, that is a reality. And we have to begin to deal with it. And here in the forum, thanks to Brother Bill, Sister Kefa, the other elders and youngsters, we are dealing with it. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's why I even make this pilgrimage to come back. It cost me $1,400 to come in here this weekend. Ain't no World Council churches paying it. There's a restriction on flying, on travel, because they got a World Assembly coming up in a couple of months and everybody wants to go to the World Assembly. So any travel has to be approved. And I wasn't about to have somebody say, well, you can't go to be with your people. I told them on Tuesday, there's a big thing happening on Thursday, and it's going through the weekend. And I is gone. And I'm here.
We thank Brother Jeffries for his lecture, and then we thank him for his sub-lecture.